The clack of a rotary phone dialing in a quiet hallway, each number clicking back into place, slow and deliberate, while the smell of something baking drifted out from the kitchen. Before anyone picked up on the other end, you were already committed. You stood there with the cord wrapped around your fingers, listening to the pulse in your ear, hoping the right person would answer. That small pause between dialing and hello felt like a doorway into something bigger. And in its own quiet way, that pause says a lot about what the 1970s taught us. If you lived through that decade, you don't remember it as a list of headlines. You remember it as textures and routines. The hum of the fridge, the scratch of corduroy on your knees, the way the television warmed up before it showed a picture. Some of us were kids figuring out the world from ground level. Some were young adults building a first apartment out of thrift store finds and borrowed courage. The lessons weren't written down anywhere. They arrived through small rules, shared spaces, and the steady rhythm of ordinary days. We'll come back to that phone in the hallway, and to the kitchen light that stayed on just a little later than necessary, and to the front porch steps that held so many conversations. They all meant more than they seemed. In many houses, the kitchen was command central. Not in a dramatic way, just in a practical, lived-in way. A calendar with squares filled in pen hung near the fridge. Maybe there was a magnet from a road trip or a church picnic holding up a note that said, "Don't forget milk." The table had marks from homework pencils and hot pans set down too quickly. The 1970s taught us that meals were not just about food, they were checkpoints. You showed up. You passed the salt. You listened. Even if you were annoyed about something at school, you still had to sit there, elbows off the table, and find a way to join the conversation. That quiet discipline of staying put, of finishing what was on your plate and hearing other people out, worked its way into you. Picture a late afternoon. The kitchen window is open just enough to let in the sound of a lawnmower down the block. The radio hums softly with a song by Elton John or Carole King, something warm and piano-driven. A parent stands at the counter, tapping a wooden spoon against the pot. You hover nearby, hoping to be allowed a taste. The linoleum floor is cool under your bare feet. Someone says, "Wash your hands." You groan, but you do it. The light above the stove makes everything look golden. In that moment, without anyone announcing it, you're learning that care looks like repetition. It looks like someone cooking again, even after a long day. The decade also taught us about waiting. Not the kind of waiting where you scroll and refresh, the kind where you stare out the window and watch for headlights. If you ordered something from a catalog, you circled it in ink, filled out a form, mailed it, and then you waited. Weeks sometimes. There was no tracking number, just trust. That slow buildup made the arrival feel earned. The cardboard box on the doorstep carried more than an object. It carried the proof that patience could turn into something real. Do you remember the feeling of cutting through packing tape with a butter knife because that's what was closest? Outside, the street was its own classroom. Sidewalk chalk dusted your fingertips. The chain on your bicycle slipped off at the worst possible moment, and you had to flip it over and fix it yourself, grease streaking your palm. The 1970s taught us a kind of low-stakes independence. You were told, "Be home when the streetlights come on," and that was the boundary. Between now and then, the neighborhood belonged to you. You negotiated rules with other kids. You decided who was it. You dealt with the mild unfairness of someone changing the game halfway through. And you learned, without a lecture, that if you wanted to be invited back tomorrow, you had to be fair today. There's a scene many of us share in some version. It's early evening. The sun hangs low, turning everything amber. You're sitting on the curb with a melting popsicle, listening to a distant garage door rattle shut. A friend calls out from across the street. A dog barks, then settles. The smell of freshly cut grass mixes with something smoky from a backyard grill. Someone's older sibling leans against a car, pretending not to watch, but watching anyway. You feel time stretching, not because it is endless, but because no one is rushing you inside yet. That stretch, those in-between hours, taught you how to be alone without being lonely. Television had its own rituals. The set didn't live in every room. It had a place of honor, or at least a fixed corner, and you gathered around it. If you wanted to see MASH or Happy Days, or later, the opening theme of The Love Boat, you had to be there when it started. No pausing, no rewinding. The 1970s taught us that stories unfold whether you're ready or not. If you missed the first 5 minutes because you were setting the table, you lived with that gap. And somehow, that made the shared laughter louder. Everyone had seen the same thing at the same time. The next day at school or work, you could say one line, just one, and someone would grin because they knew exactly what you meant. The phone in the hallway had rules too. You didn't sprawl across a bed whispering for hours. The cord only stretched so far. If someone else needed to use it, you wrapped it up. You learned to say goodbye properly, not because it was romantic, but because someone might be waiting to call. And if you were expecting a call, maybe from a new friend, maybe from someone whose voice made your stomach flip, you hovered. You listened for the ring the way you might listen for thunder. When it came, you felt it in your bones. We'll come back to that hovering because it says something about attention that's easy to forget. Clothing carried its own lessons. You might remember the feel of denim that softened over time, or the particular confidence of pulling on a favorite pair of flared jeans. Music floated through bedrooms from turntables, the needle lowering with a soft scratch before a song by Fleetwood Mac or the Bee Gees filled the room. You had to flip the record over to hear the rest. That simple act, standing up, turning it, setting it down again, taught you that enjoyment required participation. You couldn't just let it run endlessly. You were part of the experience. Here's a small truth that still surprises people. Boredom wasn't treated like an emergency. If you said, "There's nothing to do," the answer might have been, "Then find something." That wasn't cruelty. It was an invitation. You built forts from couch cushions. You rearranged your bookshelf. You learned to sit with your own thoughts. The 1970s taught us that imagination grows best when it has a little empty space to stretch into. That doesn't mean it was perfect or that everyone thrived. It means the gap between stimulation and stillness was wider, and we had to cross it ourselves. School days had their own rhythm. A metal lunchbox snapped shut in the morning. The strap of a backpack dug into your shoulder. Teachers wrote in looping chalk across green boards. You passed notes carefully, folding them into tiny squares. If you forgot your homework, there was no digital excuse. You stood there and said so. That moment of standing, owning it, was uncomfortable. And yet, it taught you that small failures didn't end the world. They were just part of it. Now picture a winter evening. The house is dim except for a lamp in the living room. The television is off. Maybe there's a puzzle on the coffee table. A parent reads the newspaper, pages rustling. You lie on the carpet, chin in hands, watching the fire if you're lucky enough to have one, or just the glow of a lamp reflecting off the wall. The clock ticks. No one is talking much. It's not tense, it's just quiet. That kind of shared silence, being in the same room without filling it, taught us that presence doesn't always need commentary. Of course, the 1970s weren't all warm kitchens and bicycle rides. Money was tight in many homes. You wore hand-me-downs without calling them vintage. You understood, sometimes too early, that adults carried worries they didn't always explain. The lesson there wasn't romantic. It was resilience. You learned to make do. You learned that pride could live in a small apartment as comfortably as in a large house. You saw neighbors help each other move furniture or watch each other's kids without drafting a contract. It wasn't perfect. There were arguments, slammed doors, and long stretches of uncertainty. But through that, you learned that stability often comes from people, not things. Humor helped. There was the house rule about the thermostat. No one touches it without permission. The way someone would stand up during a commercial break and say, "Bathroom, quick!" because you had exactly 2 minutes. The exaggerated whisper when calling someone late at night. "I hope I didn't wake you." And if you did wake them, you apologized properly. Those small courtesies formed a kind of social glue. The 1970s taught us that manners weren't about stiffness. They were about smoothing the edges of shared life. Let's step outside again for a moment. It's Saturday morning. The air is crisp. You're on the porch steps, tying your shoes. A car drives by with the windows down, music spilling out. Maybe a hint of Stevie Wonder or ABBA drifting through the neighborhood. You wave at someone's parent without thinking. The wood beneath you is slightly splintered, worn smooth in places by years of sitting. Those porch steps weren't just architecture. They were a stage for first conversations, quiet apologies, and long talks about what you might do someday. We'll come back to those steps too. Dating, for those who were there for it, had its own choreography. You asked someone out in person or through a mutual friend. There was courage in that. You showed up at the door, maybe meeting a protective parent before the person you hoped to impress. You planned around curfews. You didn't have a constant line of communication, so you made plans carefully. If you said 7 o'clock, you meant 7. The 1970s taught us that reliability was attractive. Showing up mattered. Even entertainment beyond television had weight. Going to see a movie meant standing in line, feeling the sticky floor under your shoes, holding a paper ticket. When a film like Star Wars or Jaws flickered to life, it felt enormous. You couldn't replay your favorite scene at home. You carried it in your memory instead. That act of remembering, retelling it to a friend, exaggerating a little, was part of the fun. Stories traveled by voice. Here's something quieter, the way apologies were handled. If you messed up, you often had to face the person directly. No carefully edited message. You looked at them and said, "I'm sorry." It was awkward. Your hands might have been shoved into your pockets, but afterward, there was a release. The 1970s taught us that discomfort can be a bridge, not just a barrier. And that phone in the hallway? It taught us to focus. When you were on a call, that was the activity. You weren't half listening while doing 5 other things. You leaned against the wall. You traced the pattern in the wallpaper with your eyes. You paid attention to the pauses in the other person's breathing. If the line crackled, you waited it out. That kind of attention feels rare now, but it was ordinary then. As the decade moved toward its close, some of us stepped into new roles. First jobs, first apartments, first real responsibilities. You balanced the checkbook by hand. You saved receipts in a drawer. You learned that adulthood wasn't a single door you walked through. It was a series of small choices made consistently. The lessons from kitchen tables and porch steps followed you there. Show up, listen, be patient. Fix what you can with your own hands before asking for help. We've circled back to those porch steps. Think about how many decisions were made sitting there. Whether to knock on a neighbor's door, whether to say yes to an invitation, whether to forgive someone. The wood creaked under shifting weight. The evening air cooled around you. Those steps taught us that thresholds matter. You don't have to rush across them. You can sit for a minute, and decide who you want to be when you stand up. And the kitchen light? It stayed on later than necessary because someone was waiting. Waiting for a teenager to come home. Waiting for a spouse to finish a late shift. That light was a signal. You belong here. Even if the world outside felt uncertain, that glow was steady. The 1970s taught us that belonging is often communicated in small, practical ways. A plate left in the oven to keep warm. A note on the counter. A light left on. So here's what it all adds up to. The decade didn't hand us grand speeches about character. It handed us rotary dials, vinyl records, curbside sunsets, and shared silences. It asked us to wait, to listen, to fix, to apologize, to show up. It didn't solve everything. It didn't protect everyone from hardship. But it offered a set of quiet practices that many of us still carry, even if we don't name them. Before we close, I'd love to hear from you. What was the object in your house that everyone had to share? The one that caused the most arguments or laughter? And what song from the 1970s instantly takes you back to a specific room, a specific face, a specific version of yourself? Tell that story in the comments. Someone else will read it and feel a little less alone. If this brought back a memory you haven't visited in a while, consider subscribing so we can keep exploring these rooms and streets together. And maybe tonight, if a light is left on somewhere in your house, you'll notice it the way you once noticed that phone ringing in the quiet hallway, waiting for someone to pick it up.